Cool. I think we're recording. Awesome. So welcome everyone. Happy April. Sorry for our monthly MacAdmins meetup. This month we've got John joining us to talk all things homebrew, which I'm super excited about. I don't know, John, do you want to do a quick intro for those who may not know you?
Yeah, sure. My name is John Britton. I'm the co-founder and CEO of WorkBrew. My background, I'm a software engineer. I've been a Mac user for a very long time and a Homebrew user since pretty much the very beginning. I've got a few contributions in with Homebrew in the open source project, a lot of formula and like updates to versions and things like that. I also added a command pymsync, which is helpful for managing your Python versions with Homebrew.
Nice.
Yeah, so just a software engineer and really excited about talking to people about how to manage their Macs in an enterprise setting.
Yeah, that's awesome. And definitely something super topical for me at least. So I'm sure I'll have lots of questions for you. But yeah, it looks like you brought some slides. Let me pull those up real quick.
Cool.
You
Yeah.
wanna walk us through here?
Yeah. So today, my plan was to talk about some best practices around using Homebrew in enterprise and how to kind of overcome some of these things. So the agenda is first talk a little bit about how companies are using Homebrew, and in each of these sections, I know we have like a live audience and there's some kind of like chat that goes on here. There's some questions, so please, while I'm giving, going through this, think about questions related to the topic, and then we'll stop and see if anybody has questions in each of these sections. Then talking about provisioning. So how can you deploy Homebrew to all of your fleet with an MDM tool? How to observe your fleet and see what's happening on each machine and how to manage them. What to do about security. And then if we have time, go into a little demo of WorkBrew, the product that we've been building to help Mac admins handle this kind of problem. And then obviously Q&A. So yeah, that's the agenda for today.
Sounds great.
The first kind of starting point, and yeah, at any time, like feel free to chime in with questions. But yeah, the starting point. If you're not familiar with Homebrew, Homebrew is the ubiquitous package manager on Mac OS. Tens of millions of devices have Homebrew installed. There's over 13,000 packages in Homebrew's kind of taps. The collection, the library of packages you can install with Homebrew, and it's very commonly used in software companies or in companies that have developers on Macs or even just technical professionals using Macs. The most common cases are software engineers, also continuous integration. We've seen a lot of people using Homebrew on not only Mac OS CI, but also on Linux to have parity between development and kind of CI and environments. And then another kind of context for using Homebrew in companies is distributing internal tooling. So I've talked to a lot of different organizations where they use Homebrew, they set up a private tap, and they instruct all of their team members to install some piece of software that is constantly updated by their internal tooling teams that way. When it comes to managing Homebrew within a company, there are a few different strategies that I've seen. The first is called do nothing. Basically, anybody who has a Mac can install Homebrew, do whatever they want, and it's kind of an unsupported, you know, style where if you go to the IT team and say, "Hey, my Homebrew is broken," they're like, "Sorry, like we don't support Homebrew. Like if you do that, that's up to you." Um, the second kind of strategy for IT teams with Homebrew in their fleets is kind of an informed trust strategy where we know that Homebrew exists, it's self-service. We might have some rules around saying, don't install certain packages or always make sure that these things are, vetted before you use them. And we might help you install Homebrew for the first time, but if something goes wrong, maybe we don't have a way to support that. And then the last and most sophisticated strategy is roll your own. So I've seen a lot of people using different tools like Installamator or different kind of scripts that you can find on GitHub that help you to manage deployment, maybe get ideas of what packages are installed on which machines. But generally, it's things that are built, in-house, one-off, bubblegum and duct tape style. And yeah, it's kind of difficult to manage this. So kind of the first stopping point for people in the audience and the folks here with us, how are you managing Homebrew now? I think this would be a good discussion point.
Yeah, I can definitely speak for myself. Like, the environment is definitely the former that you mentioned. So it's completely unmanaged, and uh, what internal tools teams are using to deploy tools from a private tap. But we're
Mhm.
looking to move to a model where IT is actually like installing Homebrew and updating it and patching it so that people aren't running, waiting for people to run brew update. So that's the present challenge.
Mhm. I wasn't sure if on the side here, do the comments come in here or in Slack where I should be watching?
Both. Yeah.
Both. Okay,
Yeah.
great. Thanks. Yeah. So talking about provisioning, how can we, you just said like you want to make it so that IT can manage the deployment of Homebrew. Homebrew is built to be installed and managed by the end user. The default kind of install process for Homebrew is you curl a script, send it to Bash, and it does some things. And it has a few kind of like assumptions built in. One of them is that the user account exists already. You can't be logged in. You can't be logged into a machine that doesn't have a user account yet. Also, the kind of permissioning model for Homebrew is that it expects to be run as the user. So this presents challenges for deploying via MDM or other ways. So the prerequisites, like I said, you have to have a pre-existing user account with admin access. You need interactive access to the device to run the installer. And the assumption is that there's one user account per device, which is frequently true, but not in all cases. I've definitely seen, especially in like educational contexts, where I know there's a lot of Mac admins working in universities and those kinds of places where they have many different accounts logging into the same machine. And so Homebrew kind of assumes that it's one device to one user. Um, so yeah, this is the standard Homebrew installation. You run a script that you pull off the internet. Um, one alternative, if you're looking for ways to get around the deployment of Homebrew in your organization, is an open source project created by my co-founder Mike McQuaid. It's called Strap, and what it does is bootstraps a new machine. So it goes through and it sets a bunch of default settings, things like full disk encryption. But one of the things that it does is it installs Homebrew. It can't be done in a fully unattended way, but if you have, for example, a startup's like a to-do list for your new hires or the people who are getting new machines, and the to-do list is go to this website and click this button, it's like pretty simple to use. So this is one way that you can do this. Um, Another is Homebrew has an PKG installer. Um, so you can go and use the PKG installer with your MDM tool. However, it doesn't come with Jamf, Collide, Simple MDM, Kanji, whatever specific MDM tool. It doesn't come with the things you need for your MDM. So you kind of have to roll your own script and make it work if you need to do specific settings. Um, it installs standard Homebrew just like you normally would from the script, but it still needs to be run after account creation. So you'd have to provision the machines, create the user accounts after the user has logged in for the first time and set up their account, push the PKG out to the endpoints. But this is a possible way to get this done for deployment. So yeah, going to the same point, kind of another chance like for folks in the audience, how are you deploying Homebrew? Are you managing it yourselves? Have you written scripts? I'd love to hear from you all.
I can definitely kick us off and say, we just started using the PKG installer as of last month, so we're
Oh,
we're pretty
great.
excited into
How's that
this.
been going for you?
It's good. I learned the hard way. It doesn't. It's installing Homebrew, not updating Homebrew. These are two very distinct
Yeah.
actions.
Hmm.
But yeah, no, we're using auto PKG to pick it up from GitHub and deploy with Monkey, and that's been working well so far.
Perfect. Yeah. Anybody else want to chime in on this? If not, we can keep moving. So yeah, up next, observability and management. Most companies have no idea what's going on Homebrew on these devices. There's no central management. Um, we'd like to be able to know what people are using, why they're using it, what versions they're on, know what's out of date, but also to be able to set policies and say, hey, these are things that are allowed, these are things that are not allowed, and know when something has gone, off the rails. Um, so one potential way to solve this problem is to use OS Query. So OS Query has a module called Homebrew Packages, and it lets you basically get a list of the installed packages, what version's installed, where it's installed, and things like that. So it's an open source project. I think at least one or two of the big MDM tools have OS Query kind of at their core. I think Fleet, but I'm not 100% sure. But this is something that like a lot of folks should have access to, or maybe it won't be too hard for them to get access to. So that's one way that you can get some observability into what's going on in the fleet. As for remote management, what are the things that we want to do with remote management? Well, I'd love to be able to install default packages, configure and upgrade Homebrew. I mean, you already said like a couple times, like, hey, it installs Homebrew, but it doesn't upgrade it. What do I do? Keep software up to date, including upgrades. And then when I say difficult upgrades, a common case is like, how do I upgrade Postgres? I hear over and over again that Postgres is this thing that every time somebody wants to upgrade it, it causes them major headaches because of the data directory and having to upgrade how those files are stored with changes in the way Postgres stores their data. And also, with remote management, you can provide support that unblocks your end users, right? So some techniques for getting this, there's a tool called Homebrew Bundle. This is an official Homebrew project. It's really underutilized as far as I can tell. I've been using Homebrew Bundle for a really long time, but it effectively gives you a declarative way to list out all the packages that you want to have installed on your system and make make that true. So if you say, I've got these 15 packages I want installed, you run brew bundle, now those 15 packages will be installed, right? It also has features for dealing with something called brew services, which lets you run things like Postgres or Memcache or any kind of like background service and start and stop it, similar to how you would do with like initd on a Unix system. So you can do brew service start Postgres, brew service stop, Postgres or whatever. So that's a really handy thing, and you can actually put that in your brew file. And brew files can be stored similar to like a Git config. You can have a system-wide brew file, you can have a user-specific brew file, or you can have a project brew file. So let's say in your organization, you have a software team and there's 25 engineers and they all have a bunch of dependencies installed via Homebrew. They can just put a brew file in the root of their repository, and in their setup scripts or manually, they can run brew bundle inside of that project and all the dependencies will be installed automatically. So it's a really handy feature for that use case of making sure default packages are installed. Also, when I mentioned earlier that project Strap, it has a feature in it that integrates with Brew Bundle. So if you run Strap and you have a repository with your dot files, your configuration files, it will look for a brew file in there and install all of these packages by default. And you could probably, as an IT admin, build some kind of a system out of those pieces that installs packages by default for people, whether or not they manage their own dot files repositories. Um, Another kind of configuration component is Homebrew is configurable. It has lots and lots of settings. I think there's like 80 to 100 different settings you can control on Homebrew. And all of Homebrew's configuration is managed via the environment. So you just set environment variables. Every time you run a brew command, it reads from the environment and it follows the configuration you have set in the environment. So you can do things like set a specific artifact domain. So when you do brew install, rather than going out to the Homebrew official packages, you go and you look at a specified domain that maybe you control inside your VPN or inside your firewall, and then Brew will install the packages from that domain. Or you can set things like what licenses are permitted within your organization. So a policy that says we don't allow AGPL software to be installed on our machines. If you try to install AGPL software or software that depends on AGPL software, you'll get a warning saying, hey, this is not permitted. The problem with that, though, is that it's all in the environment. So enforcement is not really something you can do. The user can just change their environment and override everything. So there's now a feature in Homebrew that you can set these configuration variables in a config file. And similar to the Git style, there's a system-wide config, a user-specific config, and a project-specific config. And generally, the way the pattern works is the more specific the config, it overrides the system-wide or the project specific will override that. There's one setting in there called homebrew system env takes priority, which makes it possible to set a configuration variable in your system-wide homebrew config and make sure that it cannot be overridden. And this helps with enforcement. So if you were able to put a file on disk, set the permissions on that file to be not writable by the end user, you could effectively set Homebrew's configuration, not just for the default installed Homebrew, but for every Homebrew install on the entire machine. So even if the user goes, downloads Homebrew code, and puts it in a different location on disk, they won't be able to change those configuration settings. So this is really valuable if you're trying to kind of automate some of those policies or configuration. And it's not only about policies of restrictions, but it's things like setting the update frequency for Homebrew, setting the verbosity, setting the developer settings. Basically, everything in Homebrew can be configured this way. And then lastly, on the remote management side, you can run brew commands via your MDM. So you can just write a script, put it in your MDM, whatever kind of system they have. The challenge with this is that Homebrew doesn't want to be run as root. And 9 times out of 10, what I've seen is when you try to run commands with brew on your MDM, it tries to run as root, and so Homebrew gets angry. So you have to do a little bit of extra work to make sure that you're changing permissions or changing users into the currently active user, specifically the user who owns Homebrew. And if you didn't distribute Homebrew yourself, you don't know necessarily where it was installed or if it was installed correctly or those types of things. But it's definitely possible from a remote management standpoint to send those commands. So again, turning it back over to the folks that are here, how are you solving some of these problems? How do you find out what packages are on your machines? How do you know what's up to date? What are you doing to manage Homebrew now?
It's definitely the Wild West for us. I don't think there's much. I think it's sort of been historically a tool that developers use to install dependencies for
Mhm.
specific projects or and so I think the onus has kind of been on like, okay, if it's a package you need, you go find it and install it, and if it's broken, you need to fix it. So there's not a lot of high level ownership for us at this point, but I think that's something that needs to
Mhm.
change ultimately. Of course,
Yeah.
security is always the other concern.
You read my mind. That's where we're going
Yeah.
next. So I think that this is an interesting topic because it's not. I don't want to say that there are security implications to using Homebrew, but really what they are is what the implication is that as your organization grows, the number of endpoints where you have Homebrew and packages installed by Homebrew installed, the challenge changes. So if you're just an individual person and you have Homebrew installed, it's no big deal to run brew update and brew upgrade and make sure things are up to date. But if you're an IT manager and you have a fleet of dozens, hundreds, or even thousands of devices, and it's your responsibility to make sure that the XZ vulnerability is patched, even though it didn't necessarily affect directly, Mac users. Pretty much everybody I've talked to has said, "Hey, I want to make sure that we're not running the version with the backdoor in it, even though it doesn't affect Mac users." How do you make sure that all 1,000, 2,000 of your devices are off of that version of a bad package? And that's not challenging when you have a couple of devices. You can just go to the device, run the command. You can SSH in, run the command. But if you have a very large fleet, it gets more and more cumbersome. So I wanted to talk about some ideas around security enforcement, things that are to do with like policies, and then also how to resolve issues. So when it comes to securing Homebrew, first stop is to educate users on best practices. Make sure that they're doing least privilege. They're doing things like only installing dependencies they truly need. The less that you do, the less exposure that you have. I've seen companies where they'll have a procedure for security review of new packages. So they'll have some way to audit what's installed. and then they'll review that once, and then every time something new gets added, maybe they, if you're using it for software dependencies in a code project, you can look at the diffs, and making sure that we trust what's being installed, or we have a good reason to add those dependencies. Um, Another way to do this is using Homebrew environment settings, like I showed you before, and installing Homebrew with custom permissions. Officially, Homebrew, the open source project, doesn't support the the installation of Homebrew in a non-standard location. So if you've ever gone to report an issue with Homebrew, you'll go through their checklist on their issue submission form, and it will say, "Hey, are you run Brew Doctor? Does Brew Doctor tell you that there are any problems?" And Brew Doctor will say, "You're not installed in the standard location. This is not supported," or "You're missing X, Y, and Z files, not supported," or "You're not running the latest version of Homebrew, not supported." And the reason they do this is, as a volunteer-run open source project, they want to make sure that everybody's running on a standard system, so they can provide the best support and they know what's what. So you're kind of like charting your own territory by installing with custom permissions in a custom location. Um, so you're kind of giving up the support, but you can do it. Um, and then another strategy has been, that I've seen, is to limit access with privilege escalation. So basically, in some companies, especially like regulated industries, I've seen this in a lot of finance companies, like banks, um, and they'll say, it's our policy to not give end users root access on their machine, but we want to make it so that they can still get root access periodically when they ask for it. And the approval process may be very easy. It may not. It may just be an audit log entry to show that something happened, and they use privileged escalation. So we'll talk about some ways to do that. And then with regards to responding to incidents, you first have to stay informed about vulnerabilities. So I have a couple of ways that you can do that. I'll show you. Have a procedure around how to respond to incidents. What I've seen is that companies will have a kind of like written document when there's an incident, what to do. And in a lot of cases, when it comes to Homebrew, it's go onto our company chat, whether it's Slack or whatever, or send an email to everybody that has steps of which commands you need to run to make sure that you're not affected by this problem anymore, which is in some cases good enough, but definitely something that could be better. Um, Make sure that you have a understanding with your Homebrew users in your company that it's a responsibility that they have to keep this stuff up to date and they have to be able to respond. And so you can give them that kind of instruction set and they can fix it. And then if you're more sophisticated, you can write your own MDM scripts to effectively run some brew commands on each device, find out what's installed, and then similarly like write some commands to run on the impacted devices only. Um, so with regards to finding issues, there's a really great website, rapology.org. You can go and you can select Homebrew. Basically, they have all of the major package managers from all the operating system distributions. So you can find out what packages are served by each one, what versions are there, and they keep like a CVE cross reference where you can find what packages are affected by what CVEs and which package managers are currently serving those. One of the great things about Homebrew's open source project is because it's so convenient and so easy to contribute to the formula. Um, Issues are really fast, like fixed really quickly. But that still, even with that, you can go to Repology, you can see, hey, for a given package, what CVEs exist on these packages. And that might give you some information about things you might want to be either upgrading or removing, or having some kind of a policy around. So that's a really good source for just being alert of what's happening. When it comes to the privilege escalation, I'm sure many of the Mac admins have seen this before, but this is new to some folks, so I'll put it here anyways. There's an app called SAP Privileges. You can basically give users a normal user account without admin privileges, and they can use this application to request elevated privileges for a temporary time. And so they get the access and then they can use that combined with a um, that installation of Homebrew in a non-standard permission configuration, that can help you achieve some of this kind of guarantees around what's getting installed and what's not allowed. So last kind of section here is same thing. It's like what are you doing about security incidents? How do you kind of think about your security posture with Homebrew?
I think I'm thinking about it more as you're talking about it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I think when you give users admin access to a machine, I think there's a certain amount of trust that kind of comes with that. So at least in our environment, I think, especially for software engineers, there's definitely a lot of like trust and verify.
Mhm.
Um, but I have heard lots of conversations with security saying like, okay, maybe there are certain demographics of users that won't have that much trust. Um, so yeah, it's good to think about alternative ways of managing homebrew in those situations. Um,
Yeah, I'd love to like dig a little bit more into that topic of deciding whether or not end users have admin access. You know,
yeah,
myself as a software engineer, I've always had admin access on my machine, and I would be very upset to not have admin access on my machine. Like, that's not something that I am very keen on. But similarly, like I was, talking to a company the other day, and they don't really have a choice. You know, they're in a regulated industry, and they have to be not only SOC 2 compliant, but they have like other kind of ISO standards they have to meet, and it's just like it's not an option. They're not allowed to do it,
yeah,
and so how to survive that is kind of something that you have to be able to work around. But I I kind of have the opinion of for each company, they should make their own determination of what their security posture is, what their level of risk is, and what the trade-off is between, whether it's developer happiness and convenience or end user, you know, um, freedom versus compliance and, high levels of security. It depends on what kind of an organization it is. But I'd be really interested to hear if, how other organizations like, think about that. If anybody
yeah.
has.
Likewise, if anyone has any experience in an environment where you're locking down Mac OS to non-admin accounts, super curious to hear. You're definitely going against the grain at that point.
So I just saw a message in here.
Yeah,
We're using our MDM to see what version of an item is installed. Only if there's a problem with it, then we ask for those old versions to update. So yeah, they're doing some kind of stuff with that. And then here, what else do we have? Yeah, okay. So those were a couple of chat messages in there. Yeah. So moving on. As I mentioned at the beginning, I'm the co-founder of a company called Workbrew, and we're building tools to solve all of these problems. So Workbrew is effectively the missing tools and support for companies that use Homebrew. And I can give you a little bit of an overview of the architecture of Homebrew and how we're solving some of these same problems, and then also give a quick demo of the product before we open up for questions about Workbrew, about any of these topics, or any other things that we want to talk about. So the architecture of Workbrew is essentially four components. The fundamental kind of base layer is Homebrew. It's the same Homebrew that everybody uses already. Homebrew, as you are probably aware, is MIT license, open source. Um, it just so happens that my co-founder is also the project leader of Homebrew and has been involved in Homebrew for a very long time. Um, but so we build Workbrew on top of Homebrew. Nothing about Homebrew changes under Workbrew. We add additional kind of functionality on top. So our architecture is that we have an installer, an agent, and a console. So the Workbrew installer is a PKG file, similar to how the Homebrew installer works. It's signed by us, so it's not going to bring any alerts or anything like that when you try to install anything. But also, it has a different installation process than Homebrew. So kind of how I mentioned earlier that you could install Homebrew with non-standard permissions. That's one of the approaches that we take. So we install Homebrew, and when we install Homebrew, we create a service account, a Workbrew user on the machine, and that Workbrew user owns the Homebrew installation. Additionally, because the Workbrew user owns the Homebrew installation, the device does not have to have a user account pre-existing. So this enables zero-touch deployment. So you can load up the PKG file in your MDM, and when a new device is provisioned, Homebrew or Workbrew can be installed already. And then when the user logs in for the first time, it's already set up and configured. Um, Additionally, when you install via the Workbrew installer, it gives you the Workbrew agent. So it installs basically a launch D process that runs in the background. It communicates with the console. So it gives basically a centralized place to manage all of this stuff, and it communicates on a regular basis, gives versions, what's installed, and then also listens for commands to be run. And then lastly, the Workbrew console is a web interface where you can manage your entire fleet of Workbrew devices. So run commands, set configurations, view devices, see what's installed, check version numbers, things like that. So yeah, that's kind of the overview of Workbrew. And then if I can, I don't think I have the ability to add my screen share onto here, but if you could add my screen share, I can show a quick demo. So this is the Workbrew console. As I mentioned, we're currently in private beta. So what that means is that you can go to our website, you can sign up, you'll talk to me, I will help you understand if this is something that works for you, and then get you a trial. But we're not generally available. You can't just go and sign up right off the webpage right now. But inside of the Workbrew console, what you'll see is down the left, you have these three main menu items, devices. So in this case, you can see a list of all the devices inside of my workspace. Up here, you can download the PKG installer and use your MDM tool to distribute it. And then down the left, you can see all the device serials. If you have an MDM tool, Workbrew integrates with your MDM tool. So in our case, we're using Kanji, and you can see that my co-founder, Mike, he has his device in Kanji. So it shows up here, and if I click this, it'll go to Kanji and show the device. It also shows you, what kind of device it is, prefix, where it's installed. If you have a Mac that's on Apple Silicon versus a Mac that's on Intel, you'll see different install locations because of how Homebrew works, what version of Homebrew you're on, and what's installed. You can drill down on a device, and within that device, you can see all of the packages that are installed, what version the package is at, and what the Homebrew core version is. So this is effectively the latest version that's available. So you can see, for example, in this case, I have A2in, which is a history manager. It's an open source project. It's pretty cool. I have 18.0.1 installed on my machine, and 18.1.0 is now available. So it's out of date. And so you can go through and you can see all the packages that are out of date and what's installed. So that's devices and kind of just like insight into what's there. The next thing is you can run commands. So if you go down here and you click brew command, new command, I can say, for example, brew install tree, and I can choose which device I want to run this on. I'm going to run it on all my devices and click create brew command. And what happens is a command is created down here, and it fans out into a number of runs. So a run is equivalent to running the command on one device. So it fans out across all the devices in my fleet, and you can see all the commands, they were all successful. And then, for example, I can drill down and see that the log output from that particular machine, right? And then lastly, there's brew environments. So I mentioned before that Homebrew is configured via environment variables. I can go in here and I can say, for example, Homebrew artifact domain, and put in, for example, artifacts example.com. And what this will do is across my entire fleet, it will set this configuration. And whenever somebody runs a brew command, rather than going to the official Homebrew sources for the packages, it'll go to this domain, which could be inside my VPN or inside my firewall, and download the packages there. Similarly, you could do something like Homebrew forbidden licenses, and you could say AGPL, right? And what this would do is say, if a user tries to install a package that is either AGPL licensed or it is has dependencies that are AGPL licensed, it'll raise an error and tell them, hey, this is not permitted. So this is just a quick overview, of what we've got going on with Workbrew. So let me stop sharing my screen there. So yeah, that's everything that I had.
Nice.
So I think I hope that you took something away about like how you can manage Homebrew, some of the challenges, potential solutions that you can do on your own, and then also that this is a problem that we see very clearly, and we're working really hard on finding on building a solution for. So if you have questions or need help with Homebrew, feel free to just go to workbrew.com and reach out to me. My email is john@workbrew.com. And then if you think Workbrew is something that would be useful for you, I'd be happy to show you some more and help you get it set up. So.
Nice. Yeah. Thank you so much for that, John. That's fantastic.
Yeah, no problem. Happy to do it.
On the console side, I'm curious if, because you mentioned the enforcing package versions is a feature, common feature request. Is that something you're able to do from the Workbrew console if you see packages being out of date?
So this actually has a lot of implications. Homebrew, the open source package manager, is a rolling release package manager, meaning that they always want to be on the latest version. Whenever a new package comes out or a new version of a package comes out, Homebrew effectively updates pretty much immediately, and it's no longer possible to install the old versions. Some packages have support for old versions via two different mechanisms. One is Homebrew versions. So there's like a tap, which is effectively a library of code that people maintain for like older versions. And then for some very particular packages, for example, Postgres, Homebrew has support for installing not just one, there's multiple formula for different versions of the same package. So you can install different versions of Postgres depending on your need. But generally speaking, packages in Homebrew are served as like the latest version. So with that in mind, when you say, hey, we want to make sure that we're running a particular version, there's not really a way for us right now to keep people on an older version, or for example, to install an older version that's been updated. Now, we do have the ability to, for example, help you enforce the upgrade process. So a new version comes out, I want to make sure all my machines are on the upgraded version. That we can help you do. And I think in future, we've heard interest about this. And I think that what it's going to take is a company or a couple of users who are very keen on this kind of a feature. But I kind of liken Workbrew to kind of like a distribution of an operating system. So if you look at like Linux, like Ubuntu, they have long-term support. And with the long-term support, you know that the packages at a set version are going to continue to be available for a long time. But also they're going to get security updates. With Homebrew, there's no such offering. So I could see a world where we had something like a Workbrew long-term support where you can basically lock in versions and know that they're going to get security updates for a period of time, predetermined period of time. As of right now, we don't do that. But that's something that I've heard interest in, and like I would definitely look at ways to achieve that kind of a distribution-like set of features.
Yeah, interesting. I could definitely see as far as like managing versions of packages, the running commands is a really useful utility there, because you can just sort of enforce, like if there's a vulnerable version of a package, you can force everyone to
exactly.
Update.
Yeah, and kind of like what I mentioned before about being like in a private beta. The way this is all kind of set up right now is really kind of just to show what's possible. But you saw that screen that shows, here's all my packages on this particular machine. This one's out of date. Very easily, we can add a button that says, click this button to update it. Or maybe more valuable is you have a dashboard and it shows you all the packages across your entire fleet that are out of date. And there's one button that says update them all, or some kind of a rule around which ones you want to update. There's definitely different use cases here. So on the software engineering side, it may be that it's very disruptive to be upgrading certain packages for engineers that they may not expect to have upgraded, out from under them. Whereas if you're using Homebrew, like with Homebrew Cask, as a way to open up basically an app store of desktop apps to your entire fleet with people who may not even know what Homebrew is, then it's a totally different story, right? So really depending on what you're trying to do, but I could definitely see a world where the experience is more like you log in, you see a dashboard, you have some kind of alerts that tell you, hey, there are these CVEs out there, they impact these 5 packages, and you have 27 hosts with this package and 58 hosts with that package. What would you like to do? Resolve, and it all gets fixed for you.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Wow.
That's kind of the path we're heading towards.
Very cool. Yeah, far cry from the way that a lot of people are using Homebrew currently.
Yeah, yeah, that's true.
Yeah. Let's see if does anyone have any other questions? I feel like I've been dominating the conversation so far.
Let's see if there's anybody in the chat.
And I was definitely interested in the agent model that you're using. Can you tell me a little bit about the architecture that, why did y'all go with that agent process, and how's that agent running and built?
So there's a really important kind of added security gain with this, which is like separation of concerns and the having least privilege. So the agent is installed on the machine and it runs under the service account, and that means that that account only has certain permissions. So, for example, Homebrew formula are Ruby code, and when you have Homebrew installed on your machine as your user, who's also an admin, when you run formula, they can potentially read files on disk that you might not want them to have access to. They may be able to do things that are malicious. It's generally not a problem with like Homebrew Core or Homebrew Cask, but Homebrew has a feature for taps where you can add like third-party libraries of software, and effectively those taps can run arbitrary code. So there's definitely some like concerns around that with your end users if they're like adding additional taps. Those taps should be like very tightly vetted. And then the other kind of motivating factor for this is we want the experience for the end user to be transparent. We want it to be exactly like Homebrew for them. And so the way that we achieve that is the agent actually kind of doubles as the interface for the console and for the user. So normally when you have Homebrew installed and you run brew, if you do like which brew, it'll tell you the path to Homebrew, and it should be opt Homebrew, right? Opt Homebrew bin or something like that. And with workbrew, what will show up in that is actually a workbrew binary, and that binary is a wrapper. So when you run brew on a machine that has workbrew installed, what happens is our wrapper receives your command and your arguments, takes it and passes it to the agent. The agent then has a special kind of code path that allows it to to use the privileges of the workbrew user to first parse the command, make sure it's a command that we wanted to let it run, and then run it. And when it comes from the console, what's great is it's exactly the same code path. So the console passes down a command, it goes to the agent then runs the command under the workbrew user. And so in both of those cases, you have an identical kind of way of everything working. And so it was built that way so that we can have like a consistent interface on both sides, give the end users a full standard brew homebrew experience, and at the end of the day, provide organizations with the ability to decide what their security posture is. So this architecture allows for full admin access for the end users. So if you're an engineering company and you want your team to have full admin access in their machines, great. This will work just fine for them. But if you're a highly regulated industry where you have to be ISO and SOC 2 compliant and all these things, and you can't give admin access, it'll work pretty much just like Homebrew does now for them, and they don't need admin access. So that's a really big like benefit for them.
Yeah, that's really cool. I can totally see the advantage there for that model.
Yeah.
And then you mentioned private taps a couple of times. How do private taps play in with Homebrew, with Workbrew? I mean,
so we don't have any specific like private taps functionality right now. We do have our own private tap where we're serving certain things that are like internal to the system to help make upgrading easier and things like that. But that's kind of TBD based off of interest and what people are looking for. So I think that like for me, something that I'd be really interested in is hearing from people about like the biggest problem that they're trying to solve. As a person, like a Mac admin, as an IT manager, when it comes to Homebrew, the thing that makes me like drives me crazy all the time is X, right? Like that's the kind of feedback that I'm on the hunt for is like knowing like, oh, I wish that there was, you know, so what I would say is like, are there things that based off of what we talked about on the homebrew kind of management side that we're aware of, and then what we showed with Workbrew are the things that you're like, why don't they do X, right? Like why
Mm.
isn't there this feature? Like I wish homebrew did Y.
Mhm.
Do you have anything like that in mind, or any other folks that are on the chat?
I mean, that the XZ vulnerability, can you talk
Yep.
about how that was an opportunity for you guys to shine?
Yeah, so I think with the XZ vulnerability, like I said, there's no direct impact on Mac users, but I still think it's a great example of something really big happened. Oh my God, what do I do? How do I fix this? And the number of people that I spoke to that were like, we don't know how many devices even have this installed is like, oh my goodness. If it had not been so like targeted at a particular distribution, um, it would have been much more impactful for like Mac users or for homebrew users. But the good news is, as soon as that was disclosed, the homebrew team was very responsive, and they went out and they updated things, and that was a very, very quick turnaround. However, when they do that, the end user devices don't get updated automatically. You have to run upgrade, right? And so I think that something like that, where we take CVE notifications and knowing what packages are installed on all the machines at all times, we can have a response plan that, depending on the policy that you choose within your company, can be automatic even, right? So, if a high critical CVE is discovered in a package that's installed on a ton of places on your fleet, either an alert can be fired, we can page somebody in your organization and they can run the command. It can be run automatically, or it could just be an alert in a window if it's lower priority or something like that. But yeah, I think that it's like very illustrative of the kind of vulnerabilities that are out there, and it doesn't only have to be security vulnerabilities. Like it can be things that are, you know, unintended bugs, right? There's been a number of times when like Apple has released something that had problems that cause data loss or things like that, and it's like you don't want to be running on this version. You need to get upgraded right away, right? Um, Being able to respond to that, know what's impacted, and then know when you're done fixing the problem. Being able to say, hey, there were 100 devices at the beginning of the day. There's one at the end of the day because that device is turned off. Okay, let's go turn it on and get it done, right? That
Yeah.
would be really valuable.
Yeah, visibility it definitely is key. I think I've seen a couple of comments here about the zero touch deployment aspect or
Mhm.
like provisioning of homebrew and packages. I think like orchestrating the onboarding of a new machine to make sure that okay, it has homebrew running, it has a certain list of packages installed.
Mhm.
I think that definitely speaks to me. I know that's a pretty common problem.
Yeah, I think that there's like the list of default packages, and then there's the list of default packages by what kind of user is this.
Right.
So I could definitely see a world where it's like you have an engineering team, and then maybe you have like a design team, maybe you have a QA team. I talked to like a video game company, and they have like a special role for scripters that need special tooling, like in the Python stack. And depending on what role these people have in your organization, the defaults might be different. A lot of teams will have, hey, it's your first day, you got your laptop. Here's a README doc that's 5 pages long and has one of the steps is install Homebrew and then install
Yeah.
these packages, right?
Right.
And one way to fix that is with brew files. So rather than say, hey, go install these packages manually, here's a brew file, like brew bundle this, and then you'll be all set.
Mhm.
With Workbrew, it's how do we, assign a brew file or effectively assign a list of packages to a group of people and make sure that they're installed and up to date at all times. Um, Definitely something that it's close to achievable today with the product, but in future, depending on prioritization of what people think are most valuable, that'll be something we'll probably do.
Yeah, I think, then you start to get into interesting conversations about integrating Workbrew or your console with tools like IDPs and MDMs to like import lists of devices and users and groups.
We currently have SSO integration and we have MDM integration. So we support Kanji and Jamf right now. So if you have, for example, one of those MDM tools, we can pull in the list of devices, connect them, know which one is which with Homebrew. The other thing I didn't cover in here was the device enrollment into the console, which I think is pretty clever. We don't need to have end users don't need to have a Workbrew account. The only people in your organization who need a Workbrew account are the ones who use the Workbrew console. So that would be your IT team, maybe someone in your engineering department, maybe somebody in your security department, but it's not every person in your company that needs access to the console. And so when you provision machines with Workbrew, you take the PKG file and you also write a key to disk in a specific location, and it auto joins to your organization, to your workspace, and it's able to find itself in your MDM tool automatically. Another really cool thing about the way the installer works is that if the user already has Homebrew installed, it upgrades Homebrew. All of the existing packages they have installed work just fine, and it basically upgrades Homebrew to Workbrew in the sense that it is now under the service account. It has the correct permissions. All of that stuff is just automatic and transparent to the user.
And that includes like the packages that are installed. Do they move
all the packages, all the casks, everything?
Wow. Yeah, that's really cool. Yeah, I was definitely thinking about that. Like, how do you migrate onto Homebrew?
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yep. So you just run the installer. And to your point about the other installer not upgrading, I think that that's something that's whether or not the installer does the upgrade, at a minimum through the console, you can do the upgrade.
True. Yeah. I can see that being helpful. I think the model that I've seen happening a lot with Homebrew is sort of like the monolith tool that deploys like every app for everyone, and it kind of orchestrates Homebrew to go through and say like, okay, run this command and it'll orchestrate Homebrew to install all these packages, kind of one size fits all. And then like as the company scales, you get to a point where it's like, okay, there's different dev teams that need different things. And so I think the brew files model is a really interesting one. It's kind of reminds me of like a Docker Compose, model where you sort of have your separate projects and each project has its own dependencies mapping. I've seen a lot of tools out there that attempt to solve that problem as well, like granular dependency tracking per project. But yeah,
it's interesting because Homebrew straddles this like two worlds. One is project dependencies. So I'm a software engineer. I work in a Ruby app, or I work in a Python app, or Go, or whatever, and it depends on Postgres, or it depends on whatever. And we install that system-wide for a particular project to have access to it. And part of the reason why it's done system-wide with Homebrew is that in some ways it's more convenient. It's more ergonomic for the end user, right? Like I'm really big on, I want to use my local editor. I don't want to use it like a cloud IDE. I want to be able to work on my local machine using all my, you mentioned my keyboard, all of this stuff is like very important to me in terms of ergonomics, right? But then at the same time, so those are like project dependencies, but then at the same time, Homebrew is also used for, I have a machine and my machine is the thing that I use to do my work, my tools, and I need all of these things installed, whether it's a desktop application like VS Code, or it's something like a command line tool like wget or tree or whatever. Like it's not really a project dependency, it's more of like machine management. And so there's this interesting hybrid between kind of like Apple in the beginning, when they made Mac OS 10, they were like, Unix is the way to go. We're going to make a Unix flavor operating system and everybody's going to love it. And that's when I switched over to using Macs, right? And one of the things that was always missing was a good package manager. If you ever use a Unix distribution, like having apt or having any kind of system for that is so valuable, and Apple just didn't make one, right? And so it's almost like when you think about it from a system-wide perspective, Homebrew is kind of like a distribution on top of Mac OS, right? It just has to stay up to date with Mac OS at all times, and so it's got this like kind of dual use. Which is really interesting to me.
Yeah, it's the missing macOS package manager. It's like right on the top of the website.
Yep.
Oh, I think there's a couple of questions. Let's see. With WorkBrew in beta testing, has any organization used it while having other privilege management services such as Beyond Trust? I saw about SAP privileges, Jamf Connect, etc. But with tools like Beyond Trust, does it mess with stuff?
It's a really good question. To be honest, am not familiar with Beyond Trust. Are you familiar with that?
I'm not. No.
Give me 1 second. I'll see what it is.
I mean, I'm assuming it's a zero trust utility device attestation.
Yeah, so I can't really speak to this because I'm not familiar, but maybe let me see here. Yeah, Tony is the one asking this question. I don't know if he's still there, but I guess the answer to the question. Oh, he's typing right now, so let's see what he has to add to this.
But WorkBrew doesn't modify Mac user permissions, right?
No, it does not.
And the key is that when a standard account or an admin account tries to use Homebrew, brew, it goes to the WorkBrew agent.
Yes.
Right.
Okay. I think I understand the question a little bit better now. So when it comes to privileges on the system, the way that we approach that is we want to let the organization kind of decide for themselves how they want to manage that. WorkBrew is designed in such a way that you do not need to have administrative privileges to have the experience of using Brew on the machine. So you can have a non-admin user with WorkBrew installed on the machine use Brew. So Brew install, Brew uninstall, those types of things. We don't touch the user's admin privileges at all. However, when I was suggesting the idea of using SAP privileges or some other kind of privilege escalation software, the way that would work is we would provide a configuration that says, don't allow a non-admin user to run a command with Brew, right? So we are going to enforce that on our side. And you would be able to use a tool like SAP privileges or some other system to allow privilege escalation. But we don't have that. We don't have anybody doing that in production right now. Our kind of approach has been, depending on the security posture of the organization, we want to be able to support whatever they want. And more of the people that we talk to lean towards full admin access on the machines anyways, so it's not as important to them. And in the cases where the highly regulated companies need to have non-admin accounts, they're perfectly fine with them being able to use Brew. So they're not trying to lock them out of Brew, right? If that was the case, then they just wouldn't use it, right? So generally the use case is I either want to use it like a normal user with admin privileges, just like a normal Homebrew user would, or I want to still give them all the benefits of Homebrew, but not have them be an admin user. Those are the two most common requests that we get on that topic.
And I guess kind of a follow-up question with that is that service account, is that an admin account?
So it's not an admin account directly. It has some special abilities that we've kind of built in around what it can do. So there are certain things that Brew does. So for example, with Brew casks, casks are an interesting case in that some casks need to escalate to admin privileges to be installed. So for example, you do Brew cask install and a package that has a PKG file, and that PKG file needs to do some kind of, it's inherently required. And this is, again, it's a setting in our, configuration on our end of, do we want to allow users to have that ability? But it's very tightly scoped. So for example, saying, if I run a Brew command, the agent will pass it along to WorkBrew, and then WorkBrew will be able to do the Brew cask install for a particular cask, and it will work. But by doing that, you're basically saying that we're allowing arbitrary code from a PKG file on the internet to run on the machine, and that's not acceptable in a highly regulated organization. And so we basically will allow them to disable that, right? So those packages would just be blocked from running. So it's all about trade-offs, really. Like it's if your end user has admin privileges anyways, like a lot of this stuff is moot. And if your end user doesn't have admin privileges and what you're allowing them to do is, get access to the software, the tools they need to do their job, it's like a good compromise to make. And if you don't want them to be able to install the software, generally you're probably not wanting to allow them to use a package manager at all. And I think that what's interesting about that like final case of not letting them just choose things, I think that there's a world where Workbrew can help companies have a wide library of software available to all of their devices that's managed and installed via Workbrew without the end user even knowing what Workbrew is. So for engineers, it's great because they already know how to use it, and that's fine. But then if you have, your other departments that want to have software installed and tools to do their job, and they don't care or know anything about Homebrew, you can give them all that stuff installed by default without them ever having to see it.
Yeah, you mentioned the multiple hats that Homebrew wears. I think that's another interesting example of how it appeals to very different users. I think you definitely don't want to be modifying Homebrew on a developer machine in ways that they're not, condoning or familiar with or
exactly
privy to.
Mm-hmm.
Well, fantastic, John. Thanks again so much for coming by and giving this demo and presentation. It's definitely learned so much more about Homebrew and also Workbrew as well. So this is great.
Awesome. Well, yeah, thanks so much for having me. This is a really good time. And yeah, like I said, if anybody wants to get in touch, just john@workbrew.com. We also have a Workbrew channel on the MacAdmin Slack, so you can come in there and chat with us. We're always looking out on there. So yeah, look forward to talking to more of you.
Cool. Thanks.
Thanks. Bye.